The transport shuttle's engines hummed with a frequency that made Marcus Chen's teeth ache. Through the viewport, Nexus Prime Academy grew larger against the star field, its crystalline spires reaching toward the void like frozen lightning. The structure was beautiful in the way that only unlimited resources and alien engineering could achieve, but Marcus had learned long ago that beautiful things in space usually meant danger. First time seeing the Academy, asked Vextar, the Zelantes student sitting across from him. The reptilian's voice carried that particular tone Marcus had grown familiar with over the past 3 months. Curiosity mixed with barely concealed amusement. To most species in the galactic community, humans were a novelty. Soft, pink, fragile creatures from some backwater world nobody had heard of until recently. Yeah, Marcus replied, keeping his voice neutral. He'd learned that showing too much emotion around the other students usually led to trouble. It's impressive. Vextar's scaled lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Wait until you see the inside. The Academy has students from 47 different species. Some of them, the Zelante leaned forward conspiratorially. Some of them have very interesting ideas about how to welcome new students. Marcus nodded politely, but didn't respond. He'd heard variations of this conversation before. The warnings that weren't really warnings, the helpful advice that wasn't really helpful. It was always the same pattern. Other species testing to see how the human would react, probing for weakness, fear, or naivety. What they didn't know was that Marcus Chun had grown up in the Australian outback during the worst environmental collapse in Earth's recorded history. He'd spent his childhood learning to read the behavior of creatures that could kill him in dozens of creative ways, from boxed jellyfish blooms that had spread inland through the flooded coastal regions to the drop bears that had evolved to be even more vicious after their habitat had been destroyed. Fear was an old friend, but it had never been his master. The shuttle docked with a soft thud that reverberated through the hull. Marcus gathered his single bag, a worn military surplus duffel that had belonged to his grandfather, and followed the other passengers through the airlock. Nexus Prime Academy's main concourse was a cathedral of space and light. The ceiling soared hundreds of meters above, supported by pillars that seemed to be grown rather than built. Holographic displays showed schedules, announcements, and rotating advertisements for various planetary consortiums. Students moved through the space in clusters, their conversations creating a babble of languages and sounds that no translation device could fully render into harmony. Marcus paused to check his schedule tablet when something hard slammed into his shoulder, sending him stumbling sideways. His bag hit the ground, spilling some of his belongings across the polished floor. "Watch where you're going, mammal," growled a voice that sounded like grinding stone. Marcus looked up to see a Crex standing over him. The species was built like a cross between a rhinoceros and a gorilla with rocky, mineral-based skin and arms that could probably crush steel. This particular Crex was young. Marcus could tell by the brighter coloration of his hide, but still easily twice Marcus's mass. "Sorry about that," Marcus said, beginning to gather his scattered possessions. A few other students had stopped to watch, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. He recognized the dynamic immediately. Predator species often established dominance hierarchies through displays of aggression, and apparently Academy's social structures weren't much different from animal behavior. "Saw the Crex laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a mountain. "That's it? Just sorry." He kicked Marcus's tablet, sending it skittering across the floor. "I think you need to learn some proper respect, soft skin." Marcus finished collecting his clothes and stood slowly. The Crex towered over him by nearly a meter, but Marcus had faced bigger threats. During the Perth food riots, he'd been cornered by a pack of feral dogs that had reverted to hunting in coordinated groups. The trick wasn't to be bigger or stronger. It was to be more dangerous than your opponent expected. "You're right," Marcus said calmly, meeting the Crex's small, black eyes. "I should have been more careful. Let me buy you a drink to make up for it." The offer clearly wasn't what the Crex had expected. The creature's rocky features twisted in confusion. Around them, the crowd of watching students murmured in various languages. Apparently, Immediate submission wasn't the human's expected response either. A drink. The Crex's voice carried a dangerous edge. I don't want your pathetic peace offering, mammal. I want you to what? Marcus interrupted quietly. His voice didn't rise, but something in his tone made the Crex stop mid-sentence. To fight you? To run away scared? To beg for mercy? Marcus tilted his head slightly, a gesture he'd learned from watching dingo packs. Which response would make you feel better about yourself? The Crex's massive hands clenched into fists. You're trying to make me look stupid. No, Marcus said, and there was nothing but honesty in his voice. I'm trying to figure out what you actually want. Because if you just want to hurt someone weaker than you, they're easier targets. And if you want to establish yourself as the dominant predator in this social group, picking on the new kid isn't going to impress anyone who matters. A new voice cut through the tension like a laser through metal. What's happening here? The crowd parted to reveal a figure that made Marcus reassess his understanding of the local power dynamics. She was clearly humanoid, but her skin had a blue-green tint that suggested aquatic evolution, and her eyes were large and dark enough to contain entire galaxies. When she moved, it was with the fluid grace of something that had evolved in 3 dimensions rather than just 2. Lady Zareth, the Crex said, his aggressive posture immediately shifting to something more respectful. Just welcoming the new student by assaulting him. Her voice carried authority that transcended species boundaries. Marcus recognized it as the tone used by someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Return to your dormitory, Grixmar. I'll speak with you later. The Crex's rocky hide flushed a darker color, but he didn't argue. As he pushed past Marcus, he leaned down to whisper, "This isn't over, soft skin." When Grixmar was gone, Lady Zareth approached Marcus with fluid steps that reminded him of hunting sharks. "You're the human exchange student," she said. It wasn't a question. "Marcus Chun," he replied, extending his hand in the traditional human greeting gesture. "And thank you for the intervention, though I'm not sure it was necessary." She studied his offered hand for a moment before taking it briefly. Her skin was cool and slightly damp like morning dew. Was it necessary? Grixmar masses nearly 200 kilograms and has natural armor plating. His species hunts by crushing prey with their bare hands. "I'm aware," Marcus said, "but conflict resolution isn't always about physical capability." Interesting. She tilted her head, studying him with those dark eyes. Most species that evolve on peaceful worlds develop elaborate social structures to avoid physical confrontation. But your psychological profile suggests Earth is classified as a Class XI Deathworld. Marcus retrieved his tablet and checked it for damage. Scratched, but functional. That's correct. Then, why didn't you fight him? A Deathworlder's first instinct should be aggressive response to threats. Who says I didn't fight him? Marcus shouldered his bag and started walking toward the dormitory section, forcing her to keep pace if she wanted to continue the conversation. I just used weapons he couldn't recognize. She was quiet for several seconds, processing this. Psychological warfare. Basic social dynamics, Marcus corrected. Bullies want predictable responses. Give them something unexpected, and they lose their script. Without a script, they have to think, and thinking isn't usually their strong suit. And if that hadn't worked? Marcus paused at an intersection, consulting his tablet for directions. The Academy's layout was designed for multiple species with different movement capabilities, which made navigation interesting. Then, I would have adapted to the situation as it developed. That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. Marcus looked at her directly. On Earth, we have a saying, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Grixmar is big and strong, but he's also young, inexperienced, and looking for validation from his peer group. Those are weaknesses I can work with. You sound like you've given this considerable thought. Where I come from, you think about these things or you don't live long enough to regret not thinking about them. They walked in silence for a few minutes, passing through sections of the Academy that showcased different architectural styles. The corridors adapted to the predominant species in each area, wider and taller for the rock-based Crex, filled with carefully humidity-controlled atmosphere for the aquatic Merthak, dimly lit for the light-sensitive shadows. "I should warn you," Lady Zaraeth said eventually, "Grixmar is friends, and your little display back there will be seen as a challenge to the established social order." "Good," Marcus said. "I was worried academy life might be boring." She stopped walking and stared at him. "You want them to target you?" "I want them to reveal themselves," Marcus corrected. "Right now, I don't know who the real threats are, what alliances exist, or how power is distributed among the student body. If they come after me, I'll learn all of that very quickly." "That's—" She paused, searching for the right word. "That's actually quite sophisticated strategic thinking." "Thank you." Marcus found the dormitory entrance and placed his palm on the biometric scanner. The door hissed open, revealing a corridor lined with individual quarters. Though I should mention, I wasn't trying to be strategic. I was just being myself. "And what exactly are you, Marcus Chun?" He turned to face her before entering his assigned quarters. "I'm someone who grew up on a world where everything was trying to kill me, including the other humans. I learned to survive by being harder to kill than the threats around me. The Academy might have different predators than Earth, but predators all behave according to similar patterns." "What patterns?" "They test their prey first," Marcus said. "They probe for weaknesses, fear responses, and escape routes. They want to be sure their target is actually weak before they commit to an attack." He smiled, and there's something in that expression that made Lady Zaraeth take an unconscious step backward. "The thing about humans is we're really good at looking like prey until it's too late for the predator to change their mind." The door to his quarters slid shut between them, leaving Lady Zaraeth standing alone in the corridor with the uncomfortable feeling that she'd just witnessed something significant. She'd read the human's psychological profile, of course. The Academy kept detailed records on all exchange students, but reading about Deathworld adaptations and meeting them face-to-face were apparently very different experiences. Inside his quarters, Marcus set his bag on the standard-issue bed and looked around the small space. It was clean, functional, and completely sterile. The walls displayed a slowly rotating view of space that was probably meant to be calming, but just reminded him how far he was from home. He unpacked methodically, placing his few possessions in the provided storage units. Most of his clothing was practical outdoor gear designed for Earth's harsh climate zones. His electronics were ruggedized military surplus, built to function in conditions that would destroy consumer equipment. At the bottom of his bag was a small wooden box that contained the only items of real value he owned, a handful of soil for his family's land, and a photo of his sister. Sarah had been killed in the Melbourne collapse, crushed when a refugee center's roof gave way during a flash flood. She'd been volunteering there, helping families who'd lost their homes to the rising sea levels. Marcus had been off-world when it happened, already accepted to the Academy exchange program. By the time he got the news, she'd been dead for 3 days. He set the photo on his small desk and stared at it for a moment. Sarah had always been the optimist in the family, the one who believed things would get better if people just worked hard enough and cared enough about each other. Marcus had inherited her sense of justice, but none of her faith in human nature. The Academy's computer system chimed softly, indicating he had a message. Marcus activated the holographic display and found a welcome message from the dean's office, along with his class schedule and a detailed orientation package. His courses were exactly what he'd expected: advanced xenopsychology, interspecies diplomacy, galactic trade law, and cultural exchange protocols, all designed to produce the kind of diplomat who could help Earth navigate its integration into galactic society. What the orientation package didn't mention was that Marcus hadn't applied for this program to become a diplomat. The Australian government had sent him here for one very specific reason: to learn how other species thought, how they organized themselves, and, most importantly, how they could be defeated if diplomacy failed. Earth was still a minor player in galactic politics, but that wouldn't last forever. Humanity's expansion into space was accelerating, and every year brought new contact with species that might see humans as competitors, prey, or simply obstacles to be removed. Marcus's job was to gather intelligence, assess threats, and develop strategies for protecting human interests in an increasingly crowded galaxy. The fact that he was doing it under the cover of an exchange student program just made it more interesting. Marcus finished unpacking and checked his chronometer. The Academy's daily cycle was based on Galactic Standard Time, which meant he had about 6 hours before his first classes began. Enough time to explore the campus, get a feel for the social dynamics, and begin mapping the relationships between different species groups. He grabbed his tablet and headed for the door, pausing only to check his appearance in the mirror. Average height for a human, average build, average features. Brown hair, brown eyes, pale skin that showed his European ancestry. Nothing about him suggested the years of survival training, combat instruction, or psychological conditioning that Earth's government had invested in him. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, just another exchange student trying to fit into a larger universe. Perfect. The corridor was empty when he emerged from his quarters, but he could hear sounds of activity from other rooms. Music that sounded like crystalline wind chimes came from one direction, while harsh, guttural conversation echoed from another. The Academy housed students from dozens of species, each with their own communication methods, social structures, and cultural practices. It was an anthropologist's dream and a security analyst's nightmare. Marcus made his way back to the main concourse, this time paying careful attention to the Academy's layout. Emergency exits, security stations, areas with heavy foot traffic, and spaces that might serve as defensible positions if things went wrong. He learned a long time ago that paranoia was just preparation that other people didn't understand yet. The concourse was busier now, filled with students heading to late-day activities or gathering in social groups. Marcus found an observation point near a large holographic display and settled in to watch. Within minutes, he could see the basic power structures emerging from the casual interactions around him. The Kreks traveled in groups of 3 or 4, their massive frames creating natural barriers that forced other species to move around them. They were loud, aggressive, and completely confident in their physical dominance. Classic apex predator behavior. The Zelanti were subtler, moving through the crowd like whispers made flesh. They spoke quietly among themselves, their reptilian features revealing nothing of their thoughts. When they interacted with other species, it was with the careful politeness of creatures who preferred to strike from ambush rather than direct confrontation. The aquatic Merthak clustered near atmospheric control stations where the humidity was highest, their gills fluttering gently in the processed air. They seemed peaceful enough, but Marcus noticed they always positioned themselves with clear lines of retreat to the nearest water access points. And watching it all from positions of subtle authority were the Altari, tall, graceful humanoids with silvery skin and large, intelligent eyes. They didn't dominate through physical presence like the Kreks or stealth like the Zelanti. Instead, they controlled through information, facilitating conversations, making introductions, and somehow always being present when important decisions were made. Lady Zareth was Altari, Marcus realized, which meant his little confrontation with Grixmar had been observed by someone with significant influence in the Academy's social hierarchy. That could be useful, or it could be dangerous. Time would tell which. A soft chime echoed through the concourse, indicating the beginning of evening meal period. Marcus watched as the various species groups began moving toward different dining areas, segregated by dietary requirements and cultural preferences. He consulted his tablet and discovered that as an omnivore, he had access to several different sections. He chose the one labeled Mixed Species Dining and followed the flow of students through a wide archway into a space that looked like someone had tried to design a restaurant for creatures that had evolved on completely different worlds. Tables and seating arrangements varied wildly, from standard chairs to shallow pools to suspended platforms. The lighting could be adjusted for different visual spectra, and the air circulation system created distinct atmospheric zones for species with different respiratory needs. Marcus selected a simple meal from the human-compatible menu and found a seat at a small table near the center of the room. From here, He could observe the social dynamics of multiple species while appearing to be simply a lone student eating dinner. It didn't take long for the pattern to emerge. Students generally stuck to their own species groups, with limited cross-species interaction except for formal exchanges of politeness. The few mixed groups that did exist seemed to be based on shared academic interests or specific project requirements rather than genuine social bonding. Interesting. If academy life was this segregated, then Earth's integration into galactic society might be more complicated than the diplomats back home realized. Species didn't just automatically get along because they were all intelligent. They had to work at it, and from what Marcus could see, most of them weren't trying very hard. Mind if I join you? Marcus looked up to find a student standing beside his table with a meal tray. The newcomer was clearly humanoid, but with skin that had a faint greenish tint and eyes that were larger than human normal. When he smiled, his teeth were perfectly white and slightly pointed. "Please," Marcus said, gesturing to the empty chair. "I'm Marcus." "Kale Voss Seth," the other student replied, settling gracefully into the seat. "I'm for Verdania Prime. You're the human exchange student everyone's talking about." "Everyone?" "Well, everyone who was in the main concourse this afternoon." Kale's voice carried a slight accent that made his words sound musical. "Your encounter with Grixmar has become quite the topic of conversation." Marcus continued eating while he processed this information. "What exactly are people saying?" "Depends on the species," Kale said. "The Krex think you're either insane or incredibly brave. The Zelanti are impressed by your psychological tactics. The Altari are debating whether you're a natural diplomat or a potential security threat." He paused, and the faculty is apparently very interested in reviewing security footage of the incident. The faculty? That was potentially problematic. Marcus had hoped to maintain a low profile while he gathered intelligence, but apparently that plan was already compromised. "Standard procedure," Kale assured him. "Any incident involving potential violence gets reviewed by the Student Safety Committee. But don't worry, Lady Zareth filed a report stating that you handled the situation with admirable restraint and sophisticated conflict resolution techniques." "That's favorable," Marcus said carefully. "Very favorable. Lady Zareth's opinions carry significant weight with the administration." Kale leaned forward conspiratorially. "Her family has strong connections to the Academy's board of directors. Having her as an advocate could be very beneficial for your time here." Marcus nodded, filing away this information about the Academy's political structures. "And what about you? What's your interest in Academy politics?" "I study xenosociology," Kale explained. "The social dynamics between different species fascinate me, especially in controlled environments like this. The Academy is essentially a laboratory for interspecies relations, and students like you from previously unknown species provide unique research opportunities." "Research opportunities?" "Don't worry," Kale laughed. "I'm not planning to dissect you or anything. But humans are the first new species to join the galactic community in over 50 years. Everyone's curious about how you'll adapt to multi-species social structures." Marcus considered this while he finished his meal. Being studied could be useful. It would give him opportunities to observe the observers and learn how different species analyze human behavior. But it also meant he'd need to be even more careful about maintaining his cover identity. "What have you observed so far?" he asked. "About humans?" Kale's eyes lit up with academic enthusiasm. "Well, you're remarkably adaptable. Most species have very specific environmental and social requirements, but humans seem able to function in almost any conditions. Your psychological flexibility is particularly impressive." "Psychological flexibility?" "The way you handled Grixmar," Kale explained. "A Krex would have responded with direct aggression. A Zelani would have retreated and planned revenge. A Merthak would have sought intervention from authority figures. But you used a completely different approach, one that neutralized the threat without escalating the conflict or compromising your own position." Marcus had to admit the analysis was accurate. "And that's unusual?" "It suggests that humans have evolved multiple behavioral strategies for dealing with threats," Kale said. "Most species develop one primary approach, fight, flight, hide, or seek help. But you seem to be able to shift between strategies based on the specific situation. That's the mark of a species that evolved in a highly variable environment. A death world, Marcus thought, but didn't say aloud. Earth has a lot of different ecosystems, he said instead. Humans had to adapt to everything from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. And that adaptation extends to social situations as well, Kale continued. It's quite remarkable, really. I'd love to interview you formally sometime, if you'd be willing. Maybe, Marcus said. Right now, I'm still trying to figure out the basic social dynamics here. Speaking of which, any advice for dealing with academy life? Kale glanced around the dining area, then leaned closer and lowered his voice. The academy has its own ecosystem, he said. Species groups tend to stick together, but there are cross-species alliances based on shared interests or mutual benefits. The key is finding your niche without threatening anyone else's position. And if someone decides to threaten my position, then you'll need allies, Kale said seriously. No individual, regardless of their species' capabilities, can survive sustained pressure from organized groups. The Academy's social structure is complex, but it follows predictable patterns. What kind of patterns? Dominance hierarchies, resource competition, territorial boundaries, Kale listed. The same basic dynamics you'd find in any ecosystem, just played out with intelligent beings instead of animals. Marcus absorbed this information while watching the other students around them. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see the subtle signs Kale was describing. The way certain individuals commanded deference from others, the careful spacing between different species groups, the complex dance of social positioning that governed every interaction. Thank you, he said finally. That's helpful context. You're welcome, Kale replied. And Marcus? Be careful with Grixmar. Krex don't forget perceived slights, and they don't forgive them either. This afternoon's confrontation was just the opening move. As if summoned by their conversation, a shadow fell across their table. Marcus looked up to see 3 Krex students standing nearby, their rocky features set in expressions of barely controlled aggression. Grixmar was in the center, flanked by 2 others who looked even larger and more dangerous than he did. Well, Marcus said quietly, I guess we're about to test some of those theories about Academy social dynamics. Kale's eyes widened as he recognized the approaching threat. Maybe I should stay, Marcus said calmly. This might be educational. The 3 Krex approached their table with the deliberate, intimidating gait of creatures that had never met anything they couldn't simply crush. Other students in the dining area began to take notice, conversations quieting as attention focused on the developing confrontation. Marcus remained seated, finishing the last of his meal as if he hadn't noticed the approaching predators. But every muscle in his body was coiled and ready, and his mind was already running through tactical options. The Academy might be a civilized environment, but civilization was just a thin layer over the same basic survival instinct that had governed life since the beginning of time. And Marcus Chun had learned those instincts on a world where failing to understand them meant death. The real education was about to begin. Grixmar stopped beside their table with the satisfied expression of a predator that had cornered its prey. His 2 companions positioned themselves to block the most direct escape routes, a tactic that Marcus recognized from pack hunting behavior, effective against most prey animals. But they'd made a critical mistake. They'd assumed Marcus would want to escape. Soft skin, Grixmar said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet dining area. I think we need to finish our conversation from earlier. Marcus looked up calmly, setting down his eating utensil with deliberate precision. I'm sorry, I thought we had finished. Was there something else you wanted to discuss? The question seemed to throw Grixmar off balance for a moment. He'd clearly expected fear, anger, or pleading, something he could use to justify escalation. Instead, Marcus's polite confusion forced him to either explain his intentions or admit he was simply looking for a fight. You embarrass me in front of half the Academy, Grixmar growled, choosing to push forward despite the tactical disadvantage. That requires correction. I see, Marcus said thoughtfully. And How exactly did I embarrass you? By apologizing for bumping into you? By offering to buy you a drink? I'm genuinely curious, because from my perspective, our interaction was quite pleasant. Around them, students from various species were watching with the focused attention that prey animals gave to predator confrontations. Marcus could see them making quick calculations about alliance structures, threat assessments, and social positioning. This wasn't just about him and Grixmar anymore. It was about establishing the Academy's social order for the current term. Kale shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wanting to leave, but trapped by the Crec's positioning. Maybe we should all, he began. No, Marcus said quietly, his eyes never leaving Grixmar's face. I'd like to hear what correction he has in mind. One of Grixmar's companions, a particularly large Crex with darker coloration, leaned forward. You need to learn respect, mammal. On our world, disrespect is answered with pain. Interesting cultural practice, Marcus replied. On my world, we have a similar tradition. When someone threatens violence against an unarmed opponent, we call it cowardice. The insult hit like a physical blow. All three Crex went rigid, their rocky skin darkening with anger. In their culture, courage was the highest virtue, and cowardice was an accusation that demanded immediate response. Marcus had just escalated the situation beyond the point where face could be saved through words alone. You dare. Grixmar's voice rose to a roar that made other students flinch. I dare what? Marcus interrupted, standing slowly. I dare point out that three heavily armed predators confronting a single unarmed student might not look like courage to outside observers. He gestured toward the watching crowd. I dare suggest that if you really wanted to settle this honorably, you'd have approached me privately instead of making it a public spectacle. The psychological attack was working. Marcus could see doubt creeping into the expressions of the other two Crex. Uncertainty about whether their friend's grievance was worth a public fight that might draw faculty attention. But Grixmar was too committed to back down now. Fine, he snarled. Private settlement. The Academy has combat training facilities that can be reserved for educational purposes. Tomorrow, after classes. Just you and me. Marcus considered this for a moment, running tactical calculations. A formal challenge would be sanctioned by Academy rules, which meant medical supervision and safety protocols. It would also be public record, visible to faculty and students alike. Most importantly, it would establish precedent for how humans handled direct threats. Acceptable, Marcus said. Combat Training Facility 7, tomorrow at 1800 hours. Standard Academy rules apply. Non-lethal force only, medical supervision required. Match ends with submission or incapacitation. Agreed, Grixmar said immediately, clearly pleased that the human had accepted what he assumed would be a one-sided beating. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly, soft skin. The three Crex moved away with the swagger of predators who'd successfully established dominance. Conversations gradually resumed around the dining area, but Marcus could feel the weight of dozens of eyes still focused on him. Word of the challenge would spread quickly through the Academy's social networks. Kale stared at Marcus with a mixture of admiration and horror. Are you insane? Grixmar massed 200 kilograms and has natural armor plating. His species evolved from ambush predators that could crush small vehicles with their bare hands. I know, Marcus said, settling back into his seat as if nothing significant had happened. What's the Academy's standard protocol for formal challenges? Medical supervision, restricted weapons, non-lethal force only, Kale recited automatically, then shook his head. But that won't help you. Crec's skin could deflect most energy weapons, and their bone density makes them nearly immune to impact trauma. How exactly do you plan to win a fight against a walking tank? Marcus smiled, and there was something in the expression that made Kale suddenly remember that humans came from a Deathworld. Who says I plan to fight him? That evening, Marcus made his way through the Academy's lower levels toward the research archives. His student access credentials allowed him entry to most of the facility's educational resources, including detailed biological and psychological profiles of all member species. If he was going to face Grixmar in combat, He needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. The archives were nearly deserted at this hour, which suited Marcus's purposes perfectly. He found a private research station and began pulling up everything the galactic community knew about Krek's physiology, psychology, and combat behavior. What he found was both enlightening and concerning. The Kreks had evolved on a high-gravity world with abundant mineral resources. Their rock-like skin wasn't just armor. It was a complex biological system that could absorb and redistribute impact energy across their entire body structure. They were incredibly strong, almost impossibly durable, and possessed a pain tolerance that would make Earth's most elite soldiers look fragile by comparison. But evolution always came with trade-offs. The same adaptations that made the Kreks nearly indestructible also imposed limitations. Their heavy bone structure and mineral-based metabolism required enormous amounts of energy to maintain. They were sprinters, not marathon runners. Their sensory organs were optimized for their homeworld conditions and didn't adapt well to different environments. Most importantly, their aggressive territorial instincts made them predictable in combat situations. Marcus cross-referenced this information with Academy records of previous formal challenges. Krek students had participated in dozens of sanctioned matches over the past several years, and their approach was remarkably consistent. Direct assault, overwhelming force, victory through intimidation, and superior physical capability. They'd never lost a formal challenge to another student. But then, no human had ever been involved in a formal challenge before. Marcus spent the next 3 hours studying combat footage, analyzing Krek's movement patterns, and developing tactical approaches. By the time he left the archives, he had a comprehensive understanding of his opponent's capabilities and a plan for dealing with them. The plan didn't involve winning a traditional fight. It involved making sure there was no traditional fight to win. Marcus's first class the next day was Advanced Xenopsychology, taught by Professor Delthara, a Merithac scholar whose reputation for intellectual rigor was legendary throughout the academy. The classroom was designed to accommodate multiple species, with environmental controls that could adjust atmosphere, lighting, and gravity for different requirements. Marcus took a seat near the back, where he could observe his fellow students while focusing on the lecture. Word of his challenge with Grixmar had spread overnight, and he could feel the weight of curious attention from several directions. Some students seemed excited by the prospect of violence. Others appeared worried about the precedent it might set, and a few, particularly the Altari, watched him with calculating expressions that suggested they were reassessing their initial impressions of human capabilities. Today we'll be discussing the psychological foundations of interspecies conflict, Professor Delthara announced, her gills fluttering gently as she spoke. Can anyone identify the primary drivers of aggressive behavior between different sentient species? Several students raised appendages, claws, or tentacles to volunteer answers. Marcus listened to their responses with growing interest. Resource competition, territorial disputes, ideological differences, fear of the unknown, all valid factors. But they were missing the deeper patterns. Excellent observations, the professor said. But I'd like to hear from our human exchange student. Mr. Chun, your species has only recently joined the galactic community. What insights might you offer from humanity's pre-contact experience? All eyes turned to Marcus, and he could feel the weight of expectation from multiple directions. This was clearly a test, not just of his academic knowledge, but of how humans thought about conflict and cooperation. On Earth, Marcus said carefully, we learned that most conflicts aren't really about the stated reasons. They're about fear. Fear that someone else's success means your failure. Fear that different means dangerous. Fear that there isn't enough of whatever matters most. Resources, territory, status, security, to go around. Professor Delthara's large eyes focused on him with interest. And how does your species address these fears? Historically? Poorly, Marcus admitted, earning some surprise chuckles from around the classroom. We've fought wars over everything from trade routes to religious differences to simple misunderstandings. But we've also learned that fear-based thinking creates self-fulfilling prophecies. If you assume someone is your enemy, you'll eventually make them into one. And the alternative? Marcus thought about Sarah, about the refugee center where she died, trying to help people who'd lost everything to climate change and social collapse. About the volunteers who'd worked alongside her, humans from dozens of different cultural backgrounds who'd chosen cooperation over conflict when everything was falling apart. Understanding, he said finally, not agreement. You don't have to agree with someone to understand why they do what they do. But if you understand their motivations, their fears, their goals, you can usually find ways to coexist without destroying each other. A Zelante student near the front raised her hand. But what about when coexistence isn't possible? When species have fundamentally incompatible needs or values? Then you have to decide whether the conflict is worth the cost, Marcus replied. On Earth, we discovered that most conflicts cost everyone more than anyone gains. The resources spent on fighting could usually accomplish more if they were invested in solving the underlying problems instead. Even when facing existential threats, pressed a correct student, not Grixmar, but one of his associates. Marcus met the student's eyes directly. Especially then, fear makes people stupid. When you're afraid for your survival, you stop thinking strategically and start reacting emotionally. That's when you make mistakes that can destroy everything you're trying to protect. The lecture continued for another hour, covering various theoretical frameworks for understanding interspecies psychology. But Marcus could tell that his comments had shifted the dynamic in the room. Students who'd been looking forward to the evening's challenge were now reassessing what they might witness. After class, Lady Zaraeth approached him in the corridor. An interesting perspective, she said. Though I notice you speak about conflict resolution in very theoretical terms for someone who's about to engage in single combat. Do I? Marcus asked mildly. The entire academy knows about your challenge with Grixmar. Students are already placing wagers on the outcome. Her dark eyes studied his face. Most are betting on how quickly you'll be defeated, not whether you'll win. And what about you, Lady Zaraeth? How are you betting? She was quiet for a moment, considering. I think, she said finally, that you're not the kind of person who accepts challenges you can't win. The question is what you consider winning to mean. Marcus smiled. I guess we'll find out tonight. His next class was interspecies diplomacy, taught by Ambassador Korthvel, a distinguished Altari whose family had been instrumental in establishing the academy. The classroom setup encouraged interaction between students from different species, with mixed seating arrangements and collaborative exercises designed to simulate real diplomatic situations. Marcus found himself partnered with a Merithax student named Coralda for a negotiation exercise involving trade disputes between aquatic and terrestrial worlds. The scenario was complex, involving environmental concerns, economic pressures, and cultural misunderstandings that had led to escalating tensions. Your approach? Coral, they asked, her voice carrying the musical quality common to her species. The terrestrial faction is clearly being unreasonable about deep ocean mining restrictions. Marcus studied the case materials carefully. Are they? Or are they operating from incomplete information about aquatic ecosystem damage? Look at the data they're working with. It's all surface-level analysis. They literally don't understand the depth of the problem. But the environmental impact is obvious to someone who evolved in aquatic environments, Marcus interrupted gently. But terrestrial species think in terms of surface geography and vertical structures. When they look at an ocean, they see empty space above a solid floor. They don't naturally grasp the concept of three-dimensional ecosystem interdependence. Coralda's large eyes widened as she reconsidered the scenario. You're suggesting the conflict is based on perceptual differences rather than actual disagreement about values? I'm suggesting that before we can negotiate a solution, we need to establish a common understanding of what the problem actually is, Marcus said. If both sides are operating from different foundational assumptions about reality, they'll never reach agreement on specific policies. They spent the next hour developing a diplomatic approach that focused on education and perspective sharing rather than traditional bargaining. When Ambassador Korthvel reviewed their work, his expression showed genuine surprise. "This is quite sophisticated," he said. "You've identified the meta-conflict underlying the surface disagreements. Most students focus on negotiating specific terms without addressing the cognitive frameworks that shape how each side interprets the situation." "Thank you, Ambassador," Marcus said. "Though I should note that my partner's insights into aquatic psychology were essential for developing the approach." Korthvel flushed a deeper shade of blue-green, clearly pleased by the recognition. "Marcus helped me understand that our differences in perception could actually be advantages if we use them to develop more comprehensive solutions." After class, several students approached Marcus with questions about his negotiation techniques. Word was spreading that the human exchange student had unusual approaches to conflict resolution, which made the evening's physical challenge even more intriguing to outside observers. Marcus used the lunch period to visit the Academy's physical training facilities. He wasn't planning to do any actual training. That would have been pointless given the time constraints, but he wanted to familiarize himself with the environment where the challenge would take place. Combat Training Facility 7 was designed to accommodate matches between different species with varying physical capabilities. The main fighting area was a circular arena with adjustable gravity, atmosphere, and surface conditions. Observation galleries could hold several hundred spectators, and medical stations were positioned for rapid response to injuries. Marcus walked around the arena's perimeter, noting sight lines, equipment locations, and environmental controls. The facility's computer system allowed participants to adjust conditions within Academy safety parameters, which meant he could potentially modify the arena to his advantage if he understood the systems well enough. A voice behind him interrupted his reconnaissance. "Second thoughts, soft skin?" Marcus turned to find Grixmar entering the facility with his two companions. The Krex leader looked confident and relaxed, like a predator approaching a guaranteed meal. "Just familiarizing myself with the venue," Marcus replied. "It's quite impressive. Your species must have contributed significantly to the design. The structural reinforcement is clearly built to handle high-impact combat." Grixmar's rocky features showed satisfaction at the implied compliment. "My people understand the importance of proper testing environments. When warriors meet in combat, the arena shouldn't limit their potential." "Absolutely," Marcus agreed, "though I noticed the environmental controls are quite sophisticated. Adjustable gravité, atmosphérique composition, surface texture. Almost like having multiple different worlds available in a single space. Standard Academy features," Grixmar said dismissively, "though they won't help you tonight. Krex warriors are adaptable to any environment." "I'm sure they are," Marcus said. "Well, I should let you get on with your preparations. See you at 1800 hours." As Marcus left the facility, he could hear Grixmar's companions discussing strategy in their native language. They were planning a quick, decisive victory that would establish Krex dominance over other species and discourage future challenges to their authority. They assumed they were facing a desperate human who'd made a serious mistake in accepting formal combat. They were half right. Marcus spent the afternoon in his quarters, reviewing everything he'd learned about Academy systems, student social dynamics, and Krex psychology. His tablet displayed schematics, psychological profiles, and tactical analyses, but the real preparation was mental. He ran through scenarios, contingencies, and decision trees until he could respond to any likely situation without conscious thought. At 1,745 hours, Marcus made his way back to Combat Training Facility 7. The corridors were busier than usual, filled with students heading toward the arena to witness the first formal challenge involving human. Marcus could hear excited conversations in a dozen different languages, all focused on the same question: how long would a human last against a Krex warrior? The observation galleries were packed when Marcus arrived at the arena. Students from every species represented at the Academy had come to watch, along with several faculty members who were presumably there to ensure safety protocols were followed. Marcus spotted Lady Zaraeth in the front row, her expression unreadable. Kale was nearby, looking worried but fascinated. Grixmar was already in the arena, stretching his massive frame and performing what appeared to be ritual combat preparations. His rocky skin gleamed under the facility's lighting, and every movement demonstrated the deadly power contained in his enormous body. Marcus approached the arena's entry point, where a medvac technician waited with monitoring equipment. Standard medical sensors, she explained, attaching small devices to his wrists and neck. They'll track your vital signs and automatically stop the match if you're in danger of serious injury. Understood, Marcus said. What about environmental controls? Am I allowed to adjust arena conditions? Within Academy safety parameters, the technician confirmed. Both participants have equal access to standard modifications: gravity, atmosphere, surface texture, lighting. Anything that might provide unfair advantage to a specific species is restricted. Marcus nodded and approached the arena control panel. Grixmar watched with amusement as the human began making adjustments to the environmental settings. Already looking for advantages, soft skin? Grixmar called out. It won't matter. Krek's warriors dominate in any conditions. Just making some minor modifications, Marcus replied, continuing to work with the controls. I hope you don't mind if I adjust things to feel a bit more like home. What he was actually doing was far more complex than it appeared. Marcus was using his understanding of the Academy's technical systems to create a specific combination of environmental conditions: reduced gravity, modified atmospheric composition, and surface texture adjustments that would interact in ways the Kreks wouldn't expect. When he finished, the arena looked almost unchanged to outside observers. The lighting was slightly different, the air seemed a bit thinner, and the fighting surface had a different texture, but nothing dramatic enough to seem like cheating. Marcus entered the arena and took his position across from Grixmar. The Kreks towered over him, a mountain of muscle and mineral armor that could probably punch through steel plating. Around them, the crowd fell silent as Academy staff performed final safety checks. This is your last chance to withdraw, Grixmar said, his voice carrying across the arena. Submit now, and I'll make this quick. Marcus looked up at his opponent and smiled. Thank you for the offer, but I think I'll see how this plays out. The medical supervisor activated the match timer. Combat will begin in 30 seconds. Remember, this is a formal challenge under Academy rules. Non-lethal force only. Match ends with submission or incapacitation. Any participant may withdraw at any time. Marcus used the final moments to center himself, drawing on years of survival training and combat conditioning. He wasn't thinking about winning or losing anymore. He was thinking about the lesson this fight would teach the Academy about humanity, about what it meant to be from a Deathworld, about why predators should be very careful when choosing their prey. The timer reached 0, and Grixmar charged. Marcus didn't move. The Kreks covered the distance between them in 3 massive strides, his arms raised to deliver a crushing blow that would end the fight immediately. His rocky features showed savage satisfaction as he closed on his apparently frozen opponent. At the last possible second, Marcus stepped aside. The movement was minimal, just enough to avoid the attack without wasting energy on unnecessary motion. But in the modified environmental conditions Marcus had created, even that small step had amplified effects. The reduced gravity and altered surface tension meant that Grixmar's charge carried him much farther than he'd intended, while the modified atmospheric composition affected his depth perception just enough to throw off his targeting. The Kreks warrior crashed into the arena wall with a sound like a landslide, his momentum completely unchecked. The impact would have killed most creatures, but his natural armor absorbed the energy and he bounced back, merely stunned rather than seriously injured. Marcus was already moving, using the few seconds of confusion to position himself for the next phase of his strategy. He wasn't trying to damage his opponent. That would have been impossible given their relative size and strength. Instead, he was doing what humans had always done when faced with superior predators. He was making the cost of hunting him higher than the potential reward. Grixmar shook his massive head and turned back toward Marcus, his small eyes now showing genuine anger instead of casual confidence. Lucky.go, Sopskin, but luck runs out. The second attack was more cautious, with Grixmar testing the arena's modified conditions before committing to a full assault. Marcus continued to evade, using minimal movements that took advantage of the environmental changes he'd created. Each near miss left the Krex more frustrated and expended more of his energy reserves. In the observation galleries, students were beginning to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't a traditional fight between warriors. It was a demonstration of completely different approaches to conflict. The Krex represented overwhelming force applied directly, while the human represented adaptive strategy based on environmental manipulation. After 10 minutes of fruitless pursuit, Grixmar was breathing heavily, his massive frame struggling with the energy demands of repeated failed attacks. Marcus, meanwhile, showed no signs of fatigue. He'd barely exerted himself, spending his energy on positioning and timing rather than direct confrontation. "Stand still and fight," Grixmar roared, frustration overwhelming his tactical thinking. "I am fighting," Marcus replied calmly. This is what fighting looks like when you're not the biggest predator in the environment. The truth hit the Krex like another wall collision. He was being hunted, stalked by a prey species that had turned his own aggression against him. Every attack was being countered, every advantage neutralized, every assumption about human weakness systematically disproven. And in the galleries, representatives from dozens of species were taking notes. Marcus allowed the pattern to continue for another 5 minutes, demonstrating that his evasive success wasn't luck or accident. Then, as Grixmar grew increasingly desperate and sloppy in his attacks, Marcus made his move. It wasn't an attack in any traditional sense. Instead, Marcus used the arena's environmental controls to make one final modification, a slight adjustment to the gravitational field that created an unstable zone directly beneath the Krex's feet. Grixmar's next charge sent him stumbling as the ground seemed to shift beneath him. His massive weight and forward momentum combined with the gravitational fluctuation to send him sprawling across the arena floor, completely disoriented and unable to regain his footing. Marcus walked over to where his opponent lay, struggling with the modified physics, and knelt down beside the Krex's head. "Do you submit?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the arena. Grixmar's small eyes burned with fury, but he could see the medical sensors flashing warning lights as his vital signs indicated dangerous stress levels. The modified environment was affecting his mineral-based metabolism in ways that could become serious if the match continued. "I submit," he said finally, the words forced through gritted teeth. Marcus stood and helped his opponent to his feet as the arena's environmental controls reset to standard conditions. Around them, the observation galleries erupted in conversations that would continue for hours. "Well fought," Marcus said, extending his hand to the defeated Krex. "Your species' reputation for strength and courage is well-deserved." Grixmar stared at the offered handshake for a long moment, then slowly reached out to clasp Marcus's much smaller hand in his massive grip. "What are you?" he asked quietly. Marcus smiled. "I'm someone who learned a long time ago that survival isn't about being the strongest predator. It's about understanding the environment well enough to make sure there are no predators at all." As they left the arena together, Marcus could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes tracking his movement. Word of this match would spread throughout the academy within hours, and throughout the galactic community within days. The unknown human species had just announced their arrival on the interstellar stage, not through conquest or intimidation, but through a demonstration of intelligence applied strategically to overcome impossible odds. It was exactly the message Marcus had been sent to deliver. But looking at the faces in the observation galleries, some impressed, some thoughtful, some calculating new threats and opportunities, Marcus realized that his mission was just beginning. Tonight had established that humans weren't prey. Tomorrow, he needed to prove they weren't predators either. The hardest battles, he reflected, were always the ones fought for understanding rather than dominance. And Marcus Chun had been trained for exactly those kinds of battles. The morning after the arena challenge brought unexpected consequences. Marcus woke to find 17 messages waiting on his personal communication device. interview requests from Academy News Services, invitations to join various student organizations, and what appear to be formal diplomatic correspondence from several planetary governments. He deleted them all without reading the details. What mattered more was the shift in behavior he observed as he made his way to breakfast. Students who'd previously ignored him now watched his movements with careful attention. Conversations quieted when he passed, then resumed in hushed tones. The correct students he encountered gave him respectful nods instead of aggressive posturing. Marcus had seen this pattern before on Earth. The complex social recalibration that followed a dramatic change in perceived threat levels. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly the Academy's rumor networks would amplify and distort what had actually happened in the arena. By the time he reached the dining area, he was overhearing conversations that bore little resemblance to reality. According to student gossip, he'd either defeated Grixmar through superior physical strength, used forbidden technology to cheat, or demonstrated mysterious psychic abilities that could manipulate gravity itself. The truth, that he'd simply understood the arena's systems better than his opponent, was apparently too mundane for the developing mythology. Marcus selected his breakfast and was looking for an empty table when Kale approached with visible excitement. "Marcus, everyone's talking about last night. The way you controlled the gravitational fields, the environmental manipulation. It was incredible strategic thinking." "Thank you," Marcus said, settling at a small table near the windows. Outside, the Academy's solar collectors were adjusting their orientation to track the local star's movement, a complex dance of engineering that reminded him of the delicate balance required for interspecies cooperation. "But I have to ask," Kale continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, "how much of that was planned versus improvised? Because from my analysis, you seem to be adapting your strategy in real time based on Grixmar's responses." Before Marcus could answer, their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Lady Zaraeth, accompanied by two other students Marcus didn't recognize. One was clearly Altari like herself, but with the distinctive markings of an older generation. The other was something entirely new to Marcus, humanoid in basic structure, but with skin that seemed to shift color and texture as he moved. "Mr. Chun," Lady Zaraeth said formally, "may I introduce you to Counselor Veltar of the Academy's student government, and Shift High, our current student body president." Marcus stood and offered the traditional human greeting gesture, which both newcomers accepted after brief hesitation. "Pleased to meet you both." "The pleasure is ours," Counselor Veltar replied in a voice that carried the authority of significant political experience. "Your performance last evening has created considerable discussion among the student body and faculty alike." Shift High's skin cycled through several color patterns before settling on a neutral gray-green. "We're here to discuss the implications of your victory for Academy social structures." "Implications?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew where this conversation was heading. "Formal challenges are rare at the Academy," Lady Zaraeth explained. "Most conflicts are resolved through mediation or social pressure. When they do occur, the outcomes usually reinforce existing hierarchies rather than disrupting them. But your approach," Veltar continued, "has introduced variables that don't fit established patterns. Students are reassessing their understanding of human capabilities and, by extension, their assumptions about interspecies power dynamics." Marcus nodded, recognizing the political complexity of the situation. "And you're concerned about stability." "We're concerned about understanding," Shift High corrected, his skin shifting to deeper blue tones. "The Academy functions because students from different species can predict each other's behavior within acceptable parameters. Unpredictability leads to fear, and fear leads to conflict. So what exactly are you asking me to do?" Marcus said directly. The three representatives exchanged glances before Veltar responded. "We'd like you to consider addressing the student body formally. Explain your methods, your intentions, your species' approach to conflict resolution. Help everyone understand what they witnessed so they can process it appropriately." Marcus considered this carefully. A formal address would give him an excellent platform for intelligence gathering. He'd be able to observe how different species responded to direct communication about human capabilities and intentions. It would also allow him to shape the narrative about humanity's role in galactic politics. When? He asked. This evening, Lady Zuraeth said. The Academy's main amphitheater. We can arrange for real-time translation to ensure all species understand your presentation. And the topic? That's entirely up to you, Shift-High replied. Though we'd suggest something that addresses the questions everyone is asking. What are humans? Where do you come from? And what do you want? Marcus smiled. I think I can work with that. After the student government representatives left, Kale stared at Marcus with a mixture of admiration and concern. You realize this is unprecedented, right? First-year exchange students don't address the entire academy. And definitely not after they've just disrupted the established social order. Disrupted how? Marcus asked, though he was genuinely curious about the xenosociologist's perspective. Species hierarchies here are usually based on predictable factors. Physical capability, technological sophistication, political influence, economic power, Kale explained. But you defeated Akrex through methods that don't fit any of those categories. You used intelligence, environmental awareness, and strategic thinking to overcome overwhelming physical disadvantage. And that's disruptive? It's revolutionary, Kale said seriously. You've demonstrated that individual capability can transcend species limitations. That changes everything about how students think about their own potential and their relationships with other species. Marcus absorbed this while finishing his breakfast. He'd known that the challenge would have political implications, but he'd underestimated how quickly those implications would propagate through the Academy's social structures. The human species was being defined by his actions, which meant every decision he made carried weight far beyond his personal circumstances. His first class that day was Galactic Trade Law, taught by Professor Mordek, a Zelanti whose reputation for intellectual precision was matched only by his impatience with student ignorance. The classroom was arranged in concentric circles, with species grouped by their legal traditions and economic systems. Marcus took his assigned seat in the section designated for developing civilizations, next to a representative from a recently contacted insectoid species whose name he couldn't pronounce. The arrangement was clearly meant to reinforce galactic hierarchies, but after the previous night's events, Marcus found himself the center of attention regardless of his assigned position. Today we'll be examining resource allocation disputes between species with incompatible economic models, Professor Mordek announced. Can anyone provide an example of a successful resolution to such a conflict? Several students offered examples, most focusing on cases where superior technology or political influence had forced weaker species to accept unfavorable terms. The professor nodded approvingly at these responses, clearly considering them examples of efficient conflict resolution. Marcus raised his hand. Yes, Mr. Chun. Professor Mordek's tone was neutral, but Marcus could sense increased attention from around the classroom. I noticed that all the examples we've discussed so far involve one party imposing their preferred solution on another party with insufficient power to resist, Marcus said. Are there examples of successful resolutions where both parties achieved their primary objectives? The question seemed to surprise the professor. Elaborate on what you mean by both parties achieving their primary objectives. Well, most resource disputes aren't really about the resources themselves, Marcus explained. They're about underlying needs, security, prosperity, autonomy, recognition. If you can address those underlying needs, you can often find solutions that give everyone what they actually want, even if it's not what they initially demanded. A crack student near the front raised his hand aggressively. That's idealistic nonsense. In zero-sum situations, one party wins and the other loses. Pretending otherwise just makes the conflict take longer to resolve. Marcus met the student's gaze calmly. Is trade a zero-sum situation? What? When two species trade resources, does one of them lose? When the Altari exchange information technology for Krex mineral exports, is someone being cheated? The Krex student hesitated, clearly seeing the trap, but not sure how to avoid it. That's different. That's mutually beneficial exchange. Exactly, Marcus said, which means that apparently zero-sum conflicts might actually be negotiation problems in disguise. If you can identify what each party actually needs, not what they say they want, but what they actually need, you can sometimes restructure the situation to create mutual benefits instead of mutual losses. Professor Mordek's reptilian features showed what might have been interest. Can you provide a concrete example? Marcus thought about the resource wars that had devastated Earth during the climate collapse and the cooperative solutions that had emerged from the worst of the chaos. On my homeworld, we had conflicts over water rights during periods of severe drought. The traditional approach was to fight over existing water sources until someone won control of them. But some communities discovered that if they pooled their resources to develop better water recovery and recycling technology, they could increase the total water available to everyone. And if such cooperation isn't possible, pressed another student. If one species' survival truly requires resources that another species needs for their own survival, then you have to decide whether short-term survival is worth long-term destruction, Marcus replied. Because conflicts that intense usually damage both sides so severely that winning becomes meaningless. Sometimes the only rational choice is to work together to find alternatives, even when cooperation seems impossible. The lecture continued for another hour, but Marcus could tell that his comments had shifted the discussion's direction. Students were beginning to think about trade disputes in terms of problem-solving rather than just power projection. The change was subtle, but it was there. After class, several students approached him with questions, including the correct student who challenged his perspective earlier. Your approach sounds reasonable in theory, the student said, but it requires trusting species who might be natural enemies. How do you verify that cooperation won't just give them advantages they can use against you later? Marcus considered the question seriously. It touched on one of the fundamental challenges of interstellar diplomacy: how to build trust between species that had evolved different survival strategies. Verification systems, he said finally, graduated cooperation with built-in safeguards. You start with low-risk collaboration on projects where mutual benefit is obvious and immediate. If that works, you gradually expand to more complex partnerships with more sophisticated monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. But what about species whose basic nature makes them untrustworthy? The student pressed. Some species are simply predators. Marcus smiled. All species are predators, in some sense. The question is what they're hunting for. Food, territory, resources, security, recognition, understanding. Everyone's hunting for something. The trick is to make sure they can get what they need through cooperation rather than conflict. And if they can't, then you make sure the cost of conflict is higher than the benefit of cooperation, Marcus said. But you do it in ways that teach rather than just punish. Because the goal isn't to defeat your enemies. It's to turn your enemies into partners. The correct student nodded thoughtfully and walked away. Marcus suspected their conversation would be repeated throughout the Academy's social networks, adding another layer to the developing narrative about human approaches to conflict resolution. Marcus spent the lunch period in the Academy's technical archives, researching presentation systems and audience psychology for different species. If he was going to address the entire student body, he needed to understand how to communicate effectively with creatures who might process information in fundamentally different ways. What he discovered was both fascinating and challenging. Visual species like the Altari responded best to structured information with clear logical progressions. Auditory species like the Merthak preferred narrative formats with emotional resonance. Kinesthetic species like the Krex needed concrete examples and physical demonstrations. And that was just the beginning. Some species processed information collectively, while others required individual contemplation time. Marcus began developing a presentation structure that could accommodate multiple cognitive styles simultaneously. It would require careful timing, multimedia support, and adaptive delivery techniques, but it was possible to create something that would work for the Academy's diverse audience. His afternoon class was Cultural Exchange Protocols, taught by Ambassador Korthvel. The session focused on formal diplomatic procedures for first contact situations, which Marcus found particularly relevant given humanity's recent entry into galactic society. The key principle, Ambassador Korthvel explained, is graduated disclosure. You begin with basic information about your species' capabilities and intentions, then gradually reveal more complex aspects of your culture as trust develops. Marcus raised his hand. What happens when the initial disclosure creates misunderstandings that complicate later communication? Can you elaborate on that scenario? The ambassador asked. Well, suppose a species initially presents themselves as peaceful and cooperative because they want to establish positive relationships, Marcus said. But their definition of peaceful includes capabilities that other species consider threatening. How do they correct the misunderstanding without seeming deceptive? The question was clearly inspired by his own situation. Humans had been presented to the galactic community as a relatively minor species from an unremarkable world, but Marcus's performance in the arena had demonstrated capabilities that didn't match that initial characterization. Challenging scenario, Ambassador Korthvel admitted. The traditional approach would be to provide additional context that explains the apparent contradiction, but that requires acknowledging that the initial presentation was incomplete, which can damage trust. Unless, suggested Lady Zarieth from across the classroom, the additional information is presented as natural progression rather than correction. If you frame new revelations as deeper understanding rather than changed facts, it preserves the relationship's foundation. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's essentially what I'm hoping to accomplish this evening. Not to contradict anyone's understanding of humanity, but to provide context that makes our capabilities more comprehensible. An interesting test case, Ambassador Korthvel observed. Class, let's analyze this situation as a real-time diplomatic challenge. What factors should Mr. Chun consider when designing his presentation? The discussion that followed gave Marcus valuable insights into how different species interpreted communication attempts. Some focused on factual content, others on emotional subtext, and still others on implications for future interactions. He realized that his evening presentation would need to work on multiple levels simultaneously to be effective. After classes ended, Marcus spent several hours in his quarters preparing his presentation materials. He decided to structure the address around 3 key themes: where humans came from, how they'd learned to survive, and what they hoped to contribute to galactic civilization. The challenge was to convey the reality of Earth as a death world without making humanity seem like a threat to other species. Marcus needed to demonstrate that humans were formidable without being aggressive, adaptive without being unpredictable, and capable without being expansionist. He began with images of Earth itself, the blue-green planet that had captured the imagination of so many species when humanity first made contact with galactic civilization. But instead of the peaceful paradise those images suggested, Marcus planned to reveal the reality of a world where survival required constant adaptation to changing and dangerous conditions. From there, he would explain how those conditions had shaped human psychology, social structures, and technological development. The goal was to help the Academy's students understand that human capabilities weren't mysterious or threatening. They were the natural result of evolutionary pressures that could be understood and predicted. Finally, he would discuss humanity's goals within galactic civilization, not conquest or domination, but partnership based on mutual understanding and shared challenges. Humans brought certain capabilities to the galactic community, but they also brought certain needs and limitations. The key was finding ways to balance contributions with requirements. As evening approached, Marcus made his way to the Academy's main amphitheater. The space was designed to accommodate thousands of beings from dozens of different species, with adjustable seating, environmental controls, and sensory accommodation systems that could be customized for any audience. When Marcus arrived, the amphitheater was already filling with students, faculty, and what appeared to be official observers from various planetary governments. Word of his presentation had clearly spread beyond the Academy itself, drawing attention from the broader galactic diplomatic community. Marcus tested the presentation systems and made final adjustments to the environmental controls. He learned from his arena experience that understanding the technical systems could provide significant advantages in challenging situations. Lady Zaraeth approached him as he finished his preparations. "Nervous?" she asked. "Focused," Marcus corrected. "This is an opportunity to establish context that will shape human galactic relations for decades. I want to make sure I get it right. Any preview of what you're planning to say?" Marcus smiled. "I'm going to tell them the truth. All of it." At exactly 1900 hours, the amphitheater's lighting dimmed, and Marcus walked onto the presentation stage. Thousands of eyes, optical sensors, and alternative visual systems focused on him as he approached the speaking platform. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carried to every corner of the amphitheater by the Academy's translation and amplification systems. "I know you have questions about humanity, about Earth, and about what happened in the arena last night. I'm here to provide answers." The audience was completely silent, waiting. "But first," Marcus continued, "I want to show you something that will help you understand those answers in the proper context." He activated the presentation system, and the amphitheater's walls transformed into an immersive display showing Earth from orbit. The beautiful blue marble that had become humanity's calling card to the galaxy. "This is my home world," Marcus said. "Beautiful, isn't it? Peaceful, serene. The kind of place where intelligent life should evolve into harmony with nature and with each other." He let the image,